Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you who's ever stopping by to watch my presentation. Today we'll be talking about communication, organized communication, and the classical approach. To start off, what is communication? If you look it up in the dictionary, communication is the act of conveying meanings from one entity or group to another through the use of mutually understood signs, symbols, and semiotic rules. Pretty easy to understand, pretty direct, but this is only on the surface. Communication becomes a lot more complex the deeper you go. For example, if you're looking at communication, as we have, broadly, and then you start to go in a deep bit more, what comes to mind? For me, first comes to mind is organizations and groups. So how I might communicate to another individual would be different how I communicate with a group, or a group communicates with another group. Then you have the structure of the groups. How do they communicate internally, from employee to employee, manager to employee, and so on. And the types of communication methods they might have. Do they only communicate from top down, the manager to the employees? Are the employees allowed to communicate horizontally? Do they work with each other, cross-train? They have different types of organized communication approaches. And of course, this list goes on and on. But one thing to remember is how is interpersonal communication performed? How it starts is one party is the communicator. They will encode a message with the use of symbols or language that they and the other party already know. They're on a similar level of knowledge. Then the communicator will use a medium to send the message, such as an app, text. They may write a letter or just speak to them, and the medium could be oral communication. Then the other party, which is the receiver, will receive the message, and they would then decode it with their understanding of the same language and provide feedback. Following is a simple communication module. The sender encodes it, sends the message through a medium, which the receiver then receives, decodes, and then provides feedback on what they interpret from the message they received. And during this whole process, there's something called noise. So this could be anything from when they're reading a text, a car goes by, blaring their horn, cussing at them, and makes them angry, and then might make their response a little more angry. Or if they're on the phone, it could be really windy and it may be hard to hear. Noise is anything that can twist or tweak not only the message that we receive, but the response they get back. Organizational communication is communication between and in, mostly in organizations. So as we talked earlier, some of the complexity, one of those complexities is the multiple approaches to organized communication. So I want to break this down through an analogy. If you have a factory, it runs in a pre-described manner to run smoothly. Right? They have rules and procedures to run their factory that was given to them beforehand. However, not all factories are the same. One factory may have a rule to everybody has to check in before they start work. Another factory may be you don't have to check in. So each factory will have their own variations and rules and processes from one another. And these factories, and then what determines this is the company behind the factory. So the company will determine what rules and processes this factory has. The different styles of organized communication are like the factories. The approaches to each organized communication method are represented by these factories, and then the companies who use these organized communication methods and approaches are represented by the organizations and the companies who are behind the factories. So earlier I started to use the term approach because organizational communication is a beast. It's a wild beast that is difficult to tame. Others may have tamed it before using one method, but that may not work for another. It's different. And the beauty about an approach is that it can be tweaked and molded to fit one's individual organization or company. Even though if they may start off with the base approach method, but then they could tweak it later on. So I like to use the term approach, and I'll be using that frequently throughout the rest of this presentation. With that in mind, I want to talk about the classical approach to organized communication. So this came out during the late 19th century to early 20th. It was primarily coming out during the Industrial Revolution, and its main goal was to increase efficiency. So companies wanted to be more efficient to make more money. They wanted to produce cars, produce goods, whatever they could, whatever they're focused on, in a faster time, making less mistakes, bringing in more money. And to summarize some of the things that can be attributed with the classical approach, we have predictability, specialization, top-down communication, obedience, and efficiency. We already talked about efficiency a little bit. I want to go and start talking about the other ones. Predictability. So when you're working with classical approach to organizational communication, a big goal of it is to be predictable. So the employees are kind of taking the place of machines. Everybody has their own job, their own task they're focused on. And so this makes it predictable to what it happens. So if you tell someone, I want you to put this and this together, it's predictable that those will be together. There's not a lot of outside influences. Specialization means we want the individual to be specialized in what they're doing. So we don't want someone who puts lids on bottles to be working on building the bottle. We want them to focus on putting the lid on the bottle. So you get specialized people to do the specialized task. Top-down communication. Communication is only going from upper management and leadership downwards throughout the organization. We're not having communication go from the employees up, so down top, and we're not having communication horizontally. Employees are not going to be cross-training or working together. And last, but most important with the classical approach is you have obedience. So if there's no obedience amongst the employees, they're trying to do their own things or improvise, then the whole purpose is defeated. You lose predictability, you lose your specialization, your top-down communication, and you're also going to hurt efficiency. So the foundations of the classical approach to organized communication is pretty important. A big cornerstone of this approach is that everything is based on tasks. Businesses have tasks that they need to complete. Thus, they give these tasks to the individuals in the company, and they delegate them throughout the hierarchy. So the leader of the organization will give their task to the middle management, which will then distribute the task to lower management, which will distribute task to the base employees. And the goal is to complete these tasks as efficiently as possible for everyone. So this kind of takes the focus away from the people, the employees. And that is what most modern day approaches focus on. Instead, the focus with the classical approach is on the process. The goal is to create the best maze. So if you had a maze and a mouse trying to get the cheese at the end of the maze, the classical approach is focused on building the best maze to make it the most efficient as possible and to pretty much make the work easier for the mouse. We don't want to teach the mouse, we don't want it to necessarily be able to learn and figure out new mazes on its own, because we want to create the most efficient mazes possible, and then we're going to keep on creating those same mazes. That's the focus for the classical approach. Some other principles that are extremely important for this approach and that kind of build the foundations of it are standard operating procedures. So the goal is to create standing operating procedures, and then they will stay the same throughout the organization. They won't change. This makes it easier for employees to learn them and to adjust to them. And then the goal is to make them as efficient as possible, and then you keep. Employee selection, this is the same thing as specialization. You are going to find the most specialized employee that is the best or very good at what they do, and then bring them in to do exactly what they've been taught to do. So this makes it very easy for them to adjust and to perform their responsibilities. Interruption-free environment. So we want to create environments where the employees are not being distracted. Distraction takes away from efficiency. The less distracted they are, the less interruptions there is, the more they can focus on the work that they have brought in because they're specialized to do their work. Incentivizing workers. So no one is going to want to do these repetitive and boring, if you would, tasks, because after a certain period of time, they're going to get boring. There's not a lot of room for growth in an individual skill set or knowledge. You need to skill something really fast. And so the most best way to incentivize these employees is through pay. The more you pay, that will increase employee happiness and also incentivize them to do the work, as repetitive as it is. And then last but not least, you have the autocratic leadership. So every classical approach communication method has, for every organization that uses this, they have one leader, and all the decisions are made by one leader alone. And then these decisions that they make to complete certain tasks are then delegated throughout the organization. Some pros of this that we've kind of talked a little bit about. I want to go into it a little bit more in detail though. One pro, for example, is that this is a great approach for organizations such as factories. Anything with a focus on repetition. Mail rooms are also extremely a good match for this as well, but the more repetitive it is, the easier it is to keep things the same, keep them efficient. It's also great for new companies or organizations that are in transition between one approach or another, or possibly in between styles. This is thanks to the simple rules and procedures that the classroom approach focuses on. They're easy to learn, they're easy to follow. So, for example, a new company that just gets started, they don't have the money or the resources or the people to focus on a human resource team or to focus on anything fancy or going too complex. They need something simple, they need something that's easy for any new employees to learn, and it's easy to follow. This is great for those companies. It's also great for organizations who are in transition because, like, hey, we have things on hold. We need something that's simple. We need something that's easy to follow, something that's going to reduce mistakes and just put things on hold for a little bit as we transition. And this is a great approach to fill in that gap. This approach also reduces mistakes that we talked about earlier, reduces mistakes and develops efficiency among employees. It's also costless as a management style. You don't need a lot of outside help. You don't need a focus on HR or other departments or programs that might cost more money. Some cons, obviously, is this approach has a low ceiling of improvement, which can lead to plateauing among employees. Once the employee does their job for a day or two and they've adjusted, especially since they're specialized in it, there's no more growth. You're just now doing the same thing over and over, and you don't have a growth in knowledge or growth in skill, and you're not going to transition to any other work. You're just doing exactly what you are trying to do. So it's difficult to grow beyond a certain point. Employees are restrained to the lack of horizontal communication. We talked about this a little earlier with top-down communication, as that is the focus. There's no horizontal communication, so employees are not going to be really working together, and if they are, it's going to be on the same exact task. So there's not going to be any cross-training, which also limits the ability to fill in positions. So if one position is empty, if you don't have someone else that is trained in that position, another employee can't cover it because they haven't cross-trained and they don't know what to do. So it also limits that. And it also limits company and employee growth alike. Also, another con about this approach is that employees can feel that they are treated unfairly or they are unimportant. They can view themselves as tools and they can feel as true tools and not people. Today, the classical organized communication approach may be a little outdated and unfitting in today's society. However, it is still very fitting for many organizations, as we mentioned earlier, new organizations or organizations that might be in a transition. The classical approach plays more of an initial role as a teacher and provides guidance for organizations to help progress down the best path for them so that they can put their best foot forward. Here are some of my references that we used earlier and throughout this presentation. Thank you so much for your time and listening and taking part in my presentation. Wish you all the best.